and this is the hand.
I see a hind leg.
It's
Yeah.
like it's
The
like
hind
a
leg.
I saw two hind legs.
Yeah,
It's
so
a
this is the
lamination.
face. No, it's a lamination actually. It's a similar image. Like this was done by a scientist called Gregory. So you would just do a two-tone image, and then you will get any of the image you can do. In fact, one of the ways you test people if they have a strong prior or not, take images and do the two-tone and check. So now you can see the dogs, most of you, yes. Now you can't unsee the dog. Every time I look, you easily look at it, right? Because in the beginning, what happened was that your brain was trying to match different models. What is it? What is it? What is it? The moment you match it, it gets sort of clicked with it. So similarly, we can also explain Gestalt ideas also. This will have two different priors that are oscillating, right? So you're going to look at the cube at one way or the other, one way or the other way. You see the face or the right. So similarly, there is no triangle there. There's no triangle. Basically, it's cut. Yeah, and so here also. So what happens is now you have a very strong prior of a triangle, right? So whenever you see the stimuli, now I can't answer the question why there is a prior for the triangle. I don't know the answer. But all these things can be explained by this idea. And why do we need this predictive coding? Is purely for ease of processing, right? Because what happens is that the moment you get it, it's a very fast process, and the next time it's a fast process. Your brain does not have to process these things again and again and build from the bottom. That's a very energy inefficient way of looking at it. All the time you're okay. Every time you look at the thing, I have to build it from the bottom. So some patterns are basically repeating patterns, right? So once you get the idea of this much I can process, I know it just repeats. Similarly for this is symmetric right down the middle. So if I process the left side, right, I can kind of predict the right side. So when we live in this world, we see all these constants in the world. That if you have symmetry, if you have something like this, it's going to be reflected this way. And if it is circular, then you know that it's a radial arrangement, right? So what happens is that you don't have to process it at every different angle. So it's a very fast pattern recognition, and that's why this kind of mechanism exists. It's kind of a cost-cutting measure. But these are examples, the simpler examples of patterns. So because you're seeing so much of these images and fine-tuning your models, models are not just fine-tuned in terms of triangles and squares and this pattern. They can be very deep mathematical models as well. So if you look at it, you might say there is no structure to it. There's Jackson Pollock's painting. But actually there are mathematical regularities which your brain actually picks up. Okay? So the models can be quite complex and people are still trying to understand how these patterns are. So now we'll come to, so now we understand how normal perception is, right? That you have a model, you have input coming in, you're going to check. Now we'll try and see why does this art feel special, right? So what happens is that there's a temporary state of unpredictability while the prediction error is happening. When we were trying to figure out what's going on, there was this period of uncertainty, right? We couldn't figure out where the Dalmatian was and things like that. And this can be as important for the emergence of perceptual pleasure as is the predictability. So what happens is that while you're going through this process of fine-tuning the model and trying to predict what it is, you have this uncertainty that gives some kind of emergence and a pleasure of viewing things. This is a painting by Giorgio Morandi, and you see this, there's a very blurred boundary between the background and the model, right? So here the artist is actually creating these errors that actually don't happen in real life. Sometimes it happens, but this is purposely giving a prediction error, right? So you have clearly made a bottle out of it, but the whole subtlety of the painting, the beauty of the painting is the fact that we don't know where this ends, right? So artists intentionally create these prediction errors that may not even be possible in the natural environment. So now you see where I'm going with this. So what the artist is trying to do, or not consciously, right? They don't go and read theories about prediction. This is what they do, and this is one of the theories that tries to understand and interpret art in one way. Is that it can be that artists are playing around with this prediction error. So while musicians use uncertainty on the when, that is the rhythm, and what, that is the melody volume, to evoke emotions in their listeners. And this is well studied. Music is much better studied than visual art. Visual artists utilize uncertainty on where and what with the same intent, right? If you see most of the Cubist art, it's like that. The previous image that I talked about is like that. So now this can work on multiple levels. We do have a very strong preference for faces. We have an area in the brain which is specifically activates for faces and expert objects and things like that. And face is one of the most strong stimuli that we always respond to. And you see this? You see that the face is normal? It's upside down. But if you tilt and see her face, it's very gory. The eyes are up. But when most people, when you see it in an upside down way, you don't see that the eyes are upside down or the mouth is upside down. It's very, very negative when you invert the picture. Okay. The reason is we have a special kind of perception for looking at faces. We look at it in a very holistic manner. Perhaps it's one of the most common patterns that we've ever seen in our life, right from the beginning of our lives. So here again, Picasso is playing with that expectation. So we do have a strong prior for a face, but he's squeezing in so many other things there, and he's separating out the parts. He's playing with the indeterminacy and uh, you know, the sort of doubts that you create in perception. And that particular act of checking with the prediction, you're going to check for the prediction, not you meaning it's not a conscious decision, but this iterative process is what sort of gives the emotional content of a painting. And that is what is done even in Tayag paintings where the faces are always distorted. So we do have a speciality for faces and bodies and even animal forms. Most art is about that. Of course, we're not talking about modern art. I'm not going there at all. But you will agree that portraits are the most common, taken photographs, and most art is about human forms and things like that. So you do have a preference for that, and the whole changing of the ratios and dimensions and creating this ambiguity with another animal form. Are there three animal forms? All this plays into this whole extending this indeterminacy. You don't know what really is happening, and that's what is going to make this artwork great. And even Aboriginal paintings, they could have made it as realistic as possible, but you see that they will always have an elongated hand. Not always, many of them are not realistic images. So sometimes this prior has to be given as a contextual image. So this is the famous Guernica anti-war painting, but unless you know what it's about, it really is hard to understand. So the priors and the aha will emerge only after a glance at the title for some contextual information. So sometimes the images have very less information. So this is supposed to be a steamboat off a harbor's mouth. It's very hard to find out what the image is, but there's a sense of movement, right? So here what happens, the prior is so biased towards movement that even without any movement, the part of the brain which processes movement actually activates. So you actually will perceive it as a movement. Okay? So they have done this study where they asked people to look at these images. Even this, the shimmering light of Monet. The brain actually interprets it as though they're watching a video or something. Because the artist is able to give such cues to activate the prior that's going to give you this, that's going to let you generate this movement part of the image. So even with faces, now different artists have different degrees to which they will give you this image. indeterminacy. This is Goya's painting when he was going through the dark, depressive phase. You know, look at it, you don't know if the head is pointed here, but head is pointed towards me, and how many heads are there. You know, that sort of gives a very kind of a negative affect in the beginning. I don't know if it ever resolves into a positive affect. The artist himself wanted to give a negative affect. Even here, you know, these are his slightly more normal paintings. Even here, the faces do not give you that whole idea that it's a face. You always have that little bit of doubt. The other extreme is an hyper realistic image. You remember this movie Polar Express, which had one of the best animations, no? And people kind of got freaked out about it. And that's called the uncanny valley. So if you have a very hyper realistic image, people don't have a good emotion. That's why you can easily emote and connect with the stock animation and stock clay. What do you call that? The clay animation. But it's very hard to do with the hyper real thing. You say, oh, this is like a cyborg, you know. But the cyborg and the clay are artificial, right? But you can easily emote with the clay. So there is some kind of preference for this indeterminacy. You don't want hyper real stuff. And if you look at the old paintings, they are not hyper real. No, you can easily look at the Dutch masters and say, look, hey, mistake here, right? That's there. So even though they did not intend it, it happens. So how this emotion, according to this theory that is created, this is a perfect example of an indeterminate stimuli, right? You just have squiggly lines, but it's supposed to be the curves of the woman. This is her leg, and this is the the hair and the cloth. So there is the artists play between the predictability and the surprise. And in the beginning, there's a minor negative affect. When I say affect, it's the emotional feel. You're sort of trying to figure it out. What is it? Then there's a small struggle